The Department of Modern Languages and Literatures and the program in Latin American Studies, along with the Office of Inclusion and Equity, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Padnos International Center, College of Education, GBSU Art Gallery, and Art and Design Department at Grand Valley State University in Michigan for organizing this event and for inviting me to give a lecture this evening. In fact, the title of my lecture has slightly changed. It's now Words Against Bullets and Bombs, Poetry as a Weapon in 20th Century Latin America. Because I will zero in on the works of certain 20th century Latin American poets who, in the sense of being relevant to us and to our times, continue to be our contemporaries. Also, I should point out here that I will quote Latin American poets, writers, thinkers, and theorists in English translations, mostly provided by Robert Marquez, unless otherwise indicated. Now, I have three epigraphs to my lecture. The first one is taken from the Peruvian Marxist theorist activist José Carlos Mariátegui, also known as the Gramsci of Latin America, who maintains in his piece called, in English translation, Art, Revolution, and Decadence. And I quote José Carlos Mariátegui, "The revolutionary nature of art does not lie in the creation of a new technique, nor does it lie in the mere destruction of the old. It lies in the rejection, dismissal, and ridicule of the bourgeois absolute," unquote. The second epigraph is taken from the Salvadoran revolutionary poet Roque Dalton's manifesto cum essay called, in English translation, Poetry and Militancy in Latin America, a piece that charts out the contours of what I wish to call a dialectically engaged, insurrectionary, decolonial poetics, a piece where Roque Dalton asserts, I quote, "It is necessary to root out this false, mechanical, destructive notion whereby the poet committed to his people and his time is an angry or excessively pained individual who goes through life saying without any further ado that the bourgeoisie is disgusting, that the most beautiful thing in the world is a union meeting, and that socialism is a garden of yielding roses under an especially mild sun." Life is not so simple, and the sensitivity a Marxist needs to be truly Marxist had better be grasped fully. Is the poet's duty to fight against mechanical, schematic thinking, unquote. And last, but by no means least, my third epigraph is from none other than the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, whom Gabriel Garcia Marquez once characterized as the 20th century's greatest poet. In his essay called Toward an Impure Poetry, challenging and even unsettling what Mariátegui himself called the bourgeois absolute in aesthetics and in poetics, Neruda proposes, I quote Neruda here, "Let that be poetry, the poetry we search for, worn with the hands' obligations as by acids steeped in sweat and in smoke, smelling of the lilies and urine spattered diversely by the trades that we live by, inside the law or beyond it. A poetry impure as the clothing we wear, or our bodies, soup-stained, soiled with our shameful behavior, our wrinkles and vigils and dreams, observations and prophecies, declarations of loathing and love, idols and beasts, the shocks of encounter, political loyalties, denials and doubts, affirmations, and even taxes," unquote. Now, in my lecture this evening, I intend to map out certain coordinates and contours of a particular segment, admittedly a relatively small segment of 20th century Latin American poetry, and otherwise inordinately diverse and rich and vast field of cultural production. In fact, I wish to advance a few points and propositions about such poetry. Their accents, of course, fall acutely on what I intend to theorize as the worldliness of poetry, not only by drawing on the Palestinian-American cultural critic and oppositional intellectual Edward Said, one whose work I admire and critique both, but also by drawing on Jose Carlos Maria Tegue, Roque Dalton, and Pablo Neruda, whom I have already quoted. And I intend to dwell on the worldliness of the word at a conjuncture that witnesses, on the one hand, capitalism's massive, unprecedented crisis, and on the other, people's movements and uprisings from, say, Brazil to the Bahamas, to Bahrain, to Bangladesh, from Puerto Rico to the Philippines to Pakistan, and particularly in the Arab world today. And I will sum up some of my points vis-a-vis Latin American poetry at the very beginning, although I'm aware that the topos of summing up is traditionally assigned to a conclusion. So in order to sum up my points, as well as to initiate some of my arguments concerning the worldliness of a certain segment of Latin American poetry, I will read my own poem called 10,000 Atypical Haikus dedicated to Caliban. But I will read only 10. So, and I think I would do well to say a few words about Caliban before I read my poem. Caliban is a character that appears in Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, where Caliban is portrayed as a slave whose land, labor, language, and the body are all colonized by his master, Prospero. But Shakespeare gives some of the most beautiful lines to Caliban, who, in fact, at one point, in his mood and mode of resistance, tells his master Prospero this, I quote, "You taught me language, but my profit on it is I know how to curse," unquote. It means that, Caliban's language has been taken away by Prospero. Caliban has learned English. Now that he has learned English, now in English he can tell his master, "Fuck you." That's what Caliban's response is to his master. So, my Caliban haikus now. Yes, the haiku in the plural. 1. Caliban, run, run. Run, 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 run. I know it's no fun. 2. Caliban, be in. Between being and seeming, Caliban is drinking. 3. Caliban is stinking while Prospero is puking, and who says they come in? 4. A fleshy white guy, Caliban's dream and boredom he wants to buy. 5. You care? And you care, but I don't. Rain or sunshine, history a snare. 6. Layer upon layer, you make the same old damn point on my foot, on my hair. 7. Progress is history's dirty joke, or its bad rhyme. Caliban fakes a sneeze. 8. Caliban comes back. Someone under the moon talks of lack. 9. Be quiet, Caliban. Don't dirty my Miranda. Caliban takes a U-turn. And last, number 10, the night's dark, it's ink. Caliban pees on the brink. His pee stains stick and stink. I'm aware that Caliban's pee stains keep stinking to bourgeois aesthetes, hell-bent as they are on preserving the so-called purity of art and literature and their bourgeois sense of aesthetic cleanliness. But Pablo Neruda already fashioned a poetics of the impure against the empire of filth-clean aesthetics. In fact, Neruda wrote a manifesto-like essay called Toward an Impure Poetry to promote such a poetics, arguing that the so-called, within quote, unholy and the, within quote, dirty, as they are judged by dominant norms, must be celebrated in the poetry of the people. Let me then take up the question of the people quickly right here. Who are the people? What is the relationship between poetry and the people? We know that bourgeois politicians speak of the people. So do transnational corporations, as also do activists of various persuasions. In fact, all kinds of things get declared and done in the name of the people. And who are the people? It is here, indeed, that I need to quote again from the Salvadoran poet Roque Dalton's Poetry and Militancy in Latin America. I quote, "In speaking of the Salvadoran people, I speak of the workers and peasants," unquote, ones who in fact constitute the majority of the people in our world today. In fact, Roque Dalton speaks of, to his own words, I quote, "people in the fullest sense," unquote. The words "the fullest sense" are significant here. In other words, Roque Dalton, from whom, of course, the theoretical, the political, the historical, and the poetic variously, if not always unproblematically, keep coming together in the spaces of his cultural productions, posits the category people in such a way that in it, the class question and the mass question dialectically intersect in the interest of a permanent cultural revolution against all forms and forces of exploitation and oppression. And the figure of Caliban is fundamentally tied to the people and their struggles in the sense I just indicated. In fact, the image of the dirty but struggling Caliban, running and running and running and sweating and puking and drinking and yet surviving and even resisting full force in the dull prose of daily living, as the Cuban critic Roberto Fernandez Retamar suggests, is indeed more than a presence. To quote Roberto Fernandez Retamar himself, I quote, "Our symbol is a Caliban. There is something that we, the mestizo inhabitants of the same isles where Caliban lived, see with particular clarity. Prospero invaded the lands, killed our ancestors, enslaved Caliban, and taught him his language to make himself understood. What else can Caliban do but use that same language? Today he has no other to curse him, to wish that red plague would fall on him. I know of no other metaphor more expressive of our cultural situation, of our reality," unquote. Indeed, Caliban is a symbol, a metaphor, and Latin American poets have variously explored and exploited his tropological elan and energia. In fact, Caliban is a presence, direct or indirect, named or sometimes even unnamed, visible or sometimes even invisible, that however serves as an energizing, even an insurgent force in the works of many 20th century Latin American poets, say from the Peruvian poets Cesar Vallejo and Antonio Cisneros, to the Venezuelan poet Edmundo Are, to the Salvadoran poets Claribel Alegria and Roque Dalton, to the Guatemalan poets Otto Rene Castillo and Marco Antonio Flores, to the Cuban poets Nicolas Guillen and Roberto Fernandez Retamar. By the way, Retamar is also a poet, although he is known as a critic in this part of the world. To the Haitian poet René de Pestre, to the Puerto Rican poets Iris M. Zavala and Pedro Pietri, just to give some quick examples here. Moreover, what have come to be known as guerrilla poems in Latin America, inaugurated by none but Che Guevara himself, also mobilize with varying effects and inflections the figure of a dirty, muddy, earthy, stinky, and thus profoundly worldly, and of course, always insurrectionary Caliban. Now I need to dwell on the notion of what I call Calibanesque worldliness here. I borrow the term worldliness from the Palestinian American theorist and critic Edward Said himself, without, of course, intending to use it stricto sensu. Rather, I take cues and clues from Said while rehearsing and expanding his term. By worldliness, then, I do not merely mean the relationship between the world and the word so as to suggest, a la Said, that words cannot be interpreted or understood without their relationship to the world as such. But by worldliness, I mean an active and activist sense of being rooted in and alive and responsive to the world, to the point that one's acute awareness of such a world leads to a praxis that can be effectively pressed into the service of our creative struggles towards change. In other words, such a worldliness, and in the Latin American context, then, such a Calibanesque worldliness, not only energizes the dialectical relationship between the world and the word, but more fundamentally inspires or stimulates us to move in the direction of struggles for change in a world characterized as it is by such configurations of forces and relations as capitalism and colonialism, differentially but acutely interlocked as they are, while accentuating the point that the Salvadoran poet Roque Dalton made quite some time ago, probably echoing Che Guevara himself, I quote, "Mere words cannot change the world." Further, such a worldliness, an activist, dialectically charged, historically engaged, Calibanesque worldliness articulates, animates, and activates class, gender, and race struggles all at once against capitalism, imperialism, racism, and patriarchy. And poetry itself, in its own relatively autonomous ways, continues to participate in such struggles in ways in which poetry itself becomes a praxis. In fact, it is none other than the revolutionary Puerto Rican poet Iris M. Zavala who ardently asserted quite some time back, I quote her, "I can only conceive of poetry as the expression of the shouts in the streets, those that are muffled, that are felt. It is placing your feet firmly on the ground and making the White House, Washington, and Wall Street all tremble, and having the tremor reach all the way to Spain. A poem is an immense yes to the wretched of the earth, with words and metaphors that challenge and confront each other in tension and struggle. To write a poem is to convert the language of the world into a legitimate instrument," unquote. Indeed, a number of Latin American poets participating in what might be called Poetry International have by now established a tradition of poetry as a praxis. Some feminist poets, in particular, have been exemplarily explicit about the question of poetry as praxis, as they seem to be responding, so to speak, to Marx's own injunction to the writers. I quote Marx here, "Rub your conceptual blocks together in such a way that they catch fire," unquote. Let's hear then certain pronouncements made in the thick of certain life and death struggles in Latin America. The Nicaraguan feminist poet Rosario Murillo, for instance, asserts, I quote, "We make a revolution as we write a poem," unquote. Almost in the same vein, the Chilean feminist poet in exile, Marjorie Agosin, says, I quote, "Don't conspire with oblivion. Tear down the silence. I want to be the appeared woman from among the labyrinths. Come back, return, return, name myself, call my name," unquote. Further, the Salvadoran feminist cultural activist Nora Mendez, some of whose poems were born through life and death struggles in the very trenches of El Salvador, raises her voice thus, I quote, "Ana Maria puts the poetry on to boil, while her courage so banners. Ana Maria, the washing stones early at the riverside. Ana Maria furious when they would touch her child, when they would bleed her land. Ana Maria furious," unquote. Yet another feminist poet, the Mexican poet Veronica Volcó, directly confronts the stark materiality of hunger in the very torn spaces of her land and language. I quote, "Hunger is the first eye of the body, the first eye in the night of the body, the eye with which flesh first sees flesh," unquote. It was about hunger. Thus, an anonymous female guerrilla fighter who herself wrote poems could say, I quote again, "Our poetry cannot afford to be just in love with the moon all the time when we have bomb craters in our own land dropped by one of the biggest nations on the planet," unquote, while suggesting that poetry can at least approximate action and even street action. It is in this very tradition of poetry as action, poetry as street action, and for that matter, poetry as a praxis, that a whole host of contemporary Latin American poets can be placed. I have mentioned a number of such poets already, but I intend to focus relatively closely on two poets, the Salvadoran poet Roque Dalton and the Nicaraguan poet Gioconda Belli, for scores of distinct yet interconnected reasons. First, these two poets remain relatively unknown and relatively unread, say compared to a Pablo Neruda or an Ernesto Cardenal or a Nicolas Guillen or even a Nicanor Parra. Second, these two poets, in my reckoning, most exemplarily took part in certain mass movements that on numerous occasions directly prompted their poetry. Third, both Dalton and Belli mobilize the tools, tropes, and topoi of political economy, moving in the direction of fashioning what I wish to call a counter-poetics of political economy. Indeed, with remarkable effects, both Dalton and Belli deploy even such political economic concepts as relations of production, use value, exchange value, and surplus value directly in their poems, given the fact that political economy continues to remain generally, if not always, ignored in the fields of literary and cultural criticism even today, and given the fact that our struggle for a just world cannot but involve political economy as nothing short of the life and death question for the global oppressed, I find it necessary to reread some of the works of Dalton and Belli, works that I argue continue to speak to our times. The worldliness of Belli and Dalton then also resides in the ways in which they continue to speak to the history of oppressions and oppositions, particularly the history of capitalism and imperialism and the history of movements against them, a history that can be traced as far back as the 15th century, at least. Indeed, Belli and Dalton continue to tell us through their works that issues of labor, production, political economy, ideology, and even dialectics remain relevant concerns for cultural productions, including poetry. Also, both Belli and Dalton, unlike those postalists such as postmodernists and post-structuralists and even some post-Marxists and some post-colonialists, believe in the possibilities of revolution, in the possibilities of inaugurating a new mode of production, and for that matter, a new political economy, possibilities that call for human creativity that challenges and even does away with at every turn with what Roque Dalton already called schematic mechanical thinking. But it is a stubborn fact that we still live in a world characterized by unequal class relations, unequal gender relations, and unequal race relations. It is also true that there are now numerous women's movements and working class and peasant movements across the world against those unequal power relations and unequal production relations. Given such a world then, the very worldliness of Belli's and Dalton's poetry resides in their ability to resonate with the people's movements against exploitation and oppression, past and present. Let me now quickly chart out certain specific tracks and trajectories with regard to the poetry of Roque Dalton and Gioconda Belli, and let me also provide certain details about their work in their respective national contexts. I will first talk about Roque Dalton and then about Gioconda Belli. Roque Dalton's mass poetics, as I call it, and Gioconda Belli's feminist geopoetics, as I call it. Pakistani poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz once remarked on poetry as a material force, I quote, "I see no borderlines between politics and poetics. In this part of the world, poetry is a matter of life and death," unquote. Reading the life and work of Roque Dalton, dramatic and politically engaged as they are, one realizes the truth claim of Faiz's assertion. Dalton, like Faiz, went to jail several times for writing poetry and opposing military dictatorship in El Salvador. Wars against bullets and bombs, that is to say. Born in San Salvador in 1935, Dalton studied law and social science in universities in El Salvador, Chile, and Mexico. He joined the Communist Party in 1955. He was arrested by the Lemus government in 1960, and he was sentenced to be shot while Roque Dalton, was preparing for death. Life visited him. The government fell only 4 days before his scheduled execution. So he was free then. Later, he went to jail again and then escaped again. He laughingly told a number of fellow poets that he was the only poet ever to dodge a CIA firing squad because an earthquake split the walls of his cell. Firing squads and bullets and bombs and bayonets figure prominently in the life of Salvadorans. In fact, both oppression and revolution have been part of daily life in El Salvador for nearly 80 years. In 1931, General Hernandez Martinez overthrew the government after the collapse of coffee prices had plunged the country into depression. Hernandez Martinez's dictatorship lasted until 1944 and was followed by a series of other right-wing military dictatorships, as usual, backed by US imperialism. Any political unrest challenging the supremacy of the few propertied families was brutally repressed by the police and the National Guard. Progressive groups fought for changing these dictatorial regimes since the uprising led by Farabundo Martí in 1932. Roque Dalton was a member of one of those groups, but on May 10, in a factional feud, Roque Dalton was assassinated. In 1979, a war between the military government and progressive forces broke out, a war in which lasted 13 years. The US government flooded Central America with military aid, helping create the Contras, convert Honduras into a US military base, and finance the death squads in Guatemala and in El Salvador. Such operations, along with direct military force, were implemented to keep wealth in the hands of the few and away from the people by eliminating democracy. The fact that Roque Dalton's poetry directly challenges capitalism, racism, and sexism with biting wit, relentless courage, and undying love will be hopefully evident from a few short poems that I will read for you. Practice, which I myself co-edited, English translation, poems by Roque Dalton, and the first one is called Deposition. Those who live in another's countries and the streets and the cities and the towns and the rivers and the lakes and the volcanoes and the mountains always belong to someone else. And for that reason, the police and the National Guard defend them from us. In the name of those who only possess hunger, exploitation, sickness, thirst for justice and thirst for water, persecutions, sentences, loneliness, negligence, oppression, death, I accuse private property of depriving us of everything. That was Roque Dalton. The second poem is called On Surplus Value, or How the Boss Robs Each Worker Twice. The domestic work of the woman creates time for the man to do work that is socially valued, work he is not fully paid for. The majority of its value the capitalist steals, barely enough to live on and keep working. This pay the man takes home and says to the woman, hey, see if you can manage to stretch it out enough to cover the costs of the domestic work. That was another poem by Roque Dalton. And here's the last one, but by no means least. It's called Like You. I love this poem. Nice lyric. I, like you, love, the sweet song of matter, the heavenly countryside of January days. My blood too boils, and I laugh through eyes that have known the sprouting of tears. I believe the world is beautiful, and that poetry, like bread, is for everyone, and that my veins do not end inside me, but in those who fight for life, who love, matter, countryside, and bread, the poetry of everyone. That was a poem by Roque Dalton. Now, Gioconda Bei indeed responded actively to Dalton's accents falling sharply on the poetry of everyone and on the fact that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. Yes, poetry is not just the private property of those aesthetic Brahmins who can endlessly unearth the intricate poetry and the dazzling punditry of, say, an Ezra Pound or a T.S. Eliot and company. In fact, Bei used to quote Roque Dalton a great deal to accentuate the need for producing the kind of poetry that immediately becomes a worldly force, a material force, by gripping the masses. Bei was born in 1948 in Nicaragua at a time when the surge of anti-Somoza activism reached a particular point of intensity involving women, particularly peasant and working class women in the various orbits of struggle. Bei joined the then vibrant Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, in 1970. In 1974, she published her first collection, called in English translation, About the Seed, that underlines Bei's militant feminist activism in the struggle against Nicaraguan military dictatorship and US imperialism. Her first novel, called in English translation, The Woman's Room, a charged feminist novel, provides a fictionalized account of how Bei became part of the FSLN raid on the dictator Somoza's friend Chema Castillo's bourgeois Christmas party on December 27, 1974. After this event, Bei went into exile in Cuba, from where, in 1978, she published yet another combative feminist socialist collection of poems called Lines of Fire. For exigencies of time and space, of course, I have to skip a cluster of historical points and a cluster of interconnected textual readings here. However, what I can do is quickly and categorically outline some of Bei's positions and suggestions that do not, however, come as neatly packaged theories. But at least some of her positions can be derived through certain symptomatic and even selective readings in the service of theory. I argue that such positions, once derived symptomatically, go into the fashioning of what I call her geopoetics of political economy as part of her avowedly third worldist, feminist, socialist undertakings. I will advance only a few positions and propositions here for further discussions. First, for Bei, the production of what she herself calls her feminist consciousness is deeply and organically informed by the history and geography of Nicaragua in ways in which all categories such as nation, nation-state, and nationalism remain crucial or even central to her feminism. Although such categories are not identical, while they are dangerously conflated in certain liberal discourses. Even a quick reading of her famous yet under-engaged poem called Nicaragua, Water, Fire, reveals this point with full force. In this poem, Bay's geographical consciousness, or for that matter, her acute spatial consciousness, serves as the motor of engineering an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-imperial revolution on the one hand, and on the other turns nation itself into something more than an imagined community in the Benedict Andersonian sense of the term. In fact, nation serves as a material site of struggle, where, according to Bay, emancipation and revolution are impossible without the emancipation of women in Nicaragua. The question Bay raises is this: how can there be any national liberation in Nicaragua or elsewhere without women's emancipation? This is a particularly revolutionary question that emanated from the new Women's Association, which was simultaneously made possible and necessitated by the Nicaraguan Revolution and Reconstruction that, of course, unevenly emphasized the question of women, remaining masculinist in many dimensions and directions, certain unprecedented changes in women's lives notwithstanding. Second, related to the first position remains the position that takes up tensions between nationalist feminism, something that the Filipina Marxist feminist theorist activist Delia Aguilar has theorized in the specific context of the Philippines in her book called Towards a Nationalist Feminism and Marxism, or for that matter, socialism itself. In general, indeed, Bay's poetry seems very sympathetic to the working class people and poor peasants and peasant women. A host of third world Marxists, Leninists such as Che, Castro, and Cabral emphasized the peasant question as the central class question and agency question that, according to them, should deeply inform and inflect the national colonial question, thus partly rehearsing and partly revising Lenin's own position. But Bay, like a number of third world feminists, seems to be suggesting that within such a matrix of relations of class and agency, gender seems either subordinated or even elided. Under such historical material circumstances, Bay then stretches a certain variant of third world Marxism to include and resituate the gender question within the specific parameters of the national colonial question in ways in which a national liberation movement right from the get-go can neither bypass class struggle nor the struggle for women's emancipation. In certain ways, then, Bay seems to be stretching third world's Marxism, Leninism in decisively and distinctly feminist directions. For her, thus, nationalism, socialism, and feminism all remain potentially interconnected. Third, for Bay, neither nationalism nor gender remains a matter of mere individual or group identity, as a number of her collections of poems from About the Seed through Line of Fire to Thunder and Rainbow suggest on differential registers. Even in her early erotic poetry, Bay, like the African-American feminist lesbian poet Audre Lorde, reinserts her body into the revolutionary body politic that she forges and reforges in her imagination in the specific geographical context of Nicaragua. Bay posits gender as relational to the overdetermined structure of power relations, which is patriarchy itself. And later, Bay even goes to the extent of positing gender as local and global production relations. And it is in this context that Bay seems to be opening up the possibilities of forging a distinctly feminist political economy in poetic terms. It is probably because of her direct engagement with political economy in the very site of the poetic production itself that she exemplarily avoids what Fanon already alerted us to: the dangers of cultural nationalism. Indeed, certain versions of cultural nationalism fetishize identity at the expense of relations and structures that produce and reproduce exploitations and oppressions of women. Bei is not interested in this kind of identity politics. Rather, Bei's poetry provides crucial clues as to third world feminist political economy as a weapon in our struggle against the macro and microstructures of patriarchal power and production and capitalism itself on both local and global scales. Fourth, the questions of poetics and praxis. As I already indicated, Bei can certainly be placed in the tradition of poetry as a praxis, as constituted by an entire constellation of third world feminist poets from Puerto Rico to Palestine to Pakistan to the Philippines, from Brazil to the Bahamas to Bangladesh. But for Bei, indeed, poetry does not automatically become a praxis. Poetry becomes a material force, or for that matter, a praxis only when it grips the consciousness of the masses by addressing their economic, social, political, and cultural problems. Now, some lines from Bei. I'm towards the end of my lecture, actually. Now, some lines from Bei. No alternative but the struggle. Nicaragua, my love, my raped girl, don't take them root. We want maize, rice, beans, for the seeds to set in the earth, where the peasant keeps in a wooden box his land reform title deed. Nicaragua, my little girl, tell them her story travels in aeroplanes to tell her story all over the world with her story. And also these lines, again from Bei in English translation. Come and give me your hand. Together we shall face future war and victory. We shall be born again, many times keeping our flag red, daughter, woman, comrade, Mariam. Lines by Bei. Now, if we bring together and synthesize some of the positions and perspectives that both Roque Dalton and Gioconda Bei articulate and advance, not only in their poetry as such, but also in some of their prose works. And further, if we look at those positions and perspectives through the lenses provided by at least those three essays I quoted already, cited already, essays such as Jose Carlos Maria Tegue's Art, Revolution, and Decadence, Roque Dalton's Poetry and Militancy in Latin America, and Pablo Neruda's Toward an Impure Poetry, we can move in the direction of formulating certain tentative positions that might characterize what I have already called a dialectically engaged, insurrectionary, decolonial poetics in the interest of our ongoing struggles against capitalism, imperialism, racism, and patriarchy. Proposition number one. In fierce opposition to what Jose Carlos Maria Tegue calls the bourgeois absolute in aesthetics and poetics, a dialectically engaged, insurrectionary, decolonial poetics holds that the poetic itself is, in the first place, dialectically overdetermined, and that the theoretical, the historical, and the political all might variously yet dialectically interact and intersect, inflecting and informing one another in the space of the poetic itself. Indeed, the bourgeois idea, even the colonialist idea that politics and theory spoil, within quote, and dirty poetry, is fully challenged and even dismantled here. In fact, following Maria Tegue's own Gramscian accent placed on the ubiquity of the political, a dialectically engaged, insurrectionary, decolonial poetics is predicated on the idea that poetry itself, for instance, the poetry of Roque Dalton and Gioconda Bei, can be variously political and even theoretical in its own ways. To take some global instances here, following Latin American poetry, it's important to see then how the Bengali revolutionary poet Qazi Nazrul Islam poetically mobilizes Marx's labor theory of value in his poem called Krishaner Gan, the peasant song in English translation. How Roque Dalton's poem itself moves in the direction of theorizing surplus value in feminist terms. How the Korean poet Kim Chi-ha in his poetry advances theoretical points vis-a-vis class exploitation and oppression. How the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish in his entire oeuvre keeps theorizing that those four crucial sites, land, labor, language, and the body, turn out to be the sites of both oppression and opposition. Also, I would do well to quote here my favorite Afghan poet, critic, theorist, Partho Naderi, who says, I quote, "Political poetry perhaps was born when it stood against politics itself and said, I don't accept you." In other words, political poetry originates from its encounter with politics. In fact, when poetry withdraws from politics, within quote, it politicizes itself, because abandoning politics is the politics of another kind, unquote. Proposition 2, a dialectically engaged, insurrectionary, decolonial poetics holds that the very creation of beauty cannot but be a political task insofar as it involves power struggles between the competing notions of beauty within a given historic hegemonic bloc, to use Antonio Gramsci's famous term. And further, insofar as the creation of beauty involves its own production and reproduction in a world that threatens and even tends to destroy the beautiful in a variety of ways. Also, such a poetics poses this question: doesn't beauty itself involve the question of justice in its profoundly political sense? The answer is yes. As Partho Naderi poses the rhetorical question quickly and quite simply, I quote, "How can something unjust be called beautiful?" While adding, I quote, again I quote Partho Naderi, "One of the ugliest things in the world is capitalism's ruthless exploitation of labor power and turning human beings into things, into commodities," unquote. Now, taking cues and clues from Jose Carlos Maria Tegué, Roque Dalton, and Pablo Neruda, as well as from the cultural critic, Frankfurt School theorist, Walter Benjamin, an insurrectionary decolonial poetics does not aestheticize politics as such, but politicizes aesthetics itself. Proposition 3, a dialectically engaged, insurrectionary, decolonial poetics posits the relationship between poetry and the people in a profoundly democratic way. Democratic in a bourgeois, even revolutionary sense. Such a poetics accentuates the creativity of the people, I quote, "creativity in the fullest sense," unquote, and the people in the fullest sense, again, these are within quotes, to use Roque Dalton's own words, the people here being a category in which the class question and the mass question dialectically intersect. Also, to the extent that poetry is, like other signifying and discursive practices and ideological production, poetry too variously chooses sides in the struggles of the people for living in the world and even for changing the world itself. And this is the last proposition, again by no means least. After that I will stop. Proposition 4. Finally, it is in the interest of the creation of beauty, and it is in the interest of justice, and it is in the interest of building a new just world that a dialectically engaged insurrectionary decolonial poetics always and even characteristically continues to confront and combat at various levels, such macrostructures of production relations and power relations as capitalism, imperialism, racism, and patriarchy, and all forms and forces of exploitation and oppression in the world. Power to the people. Power to their poetry. Thank you.
Woo!
Yeah.
Some questions? Do you want to make questions? If our